Welcome once again to Heart of a Shepherd. We are now back in the book of 2 Samuel as we continue our chronological study of the scriptures. Now, I've titled this devotional, Chickens Coming Home to Roost. I do invite you, open your Bible with me to 2 Samuel 16. Well, we are continuing in the life and the reign of David, the king of Israel. Now, chapter 16, we have spoken of what happens in this chapter before, but it depicts David's quick escape from Jerusalem as Absalom, his third son, gained the people's support and led a rebellion against his father. And so in 2 Samuel 16, we find adding to David's sorrows was the news that Ahithophel, trusted counselor and the grandfather of Bathsheba, had joined Absalom's rebellion. Now that was recorded in chapter 15. Now, to counter Ahithophel's counsel, you'll remember, we've referred to this before, David ordered Hushai, or Hushai, some would say, the Archite, who was a loyal friend and servant, to return to Jerusalem and align himself with Absalom and act as a spy in his son's court. Well, chapter 16 and verses 1 through 4, then, we have an act of deceit. Now, as David, his family, and entourage of warriors fled Jerusalem, they encountered Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth. Chapter 16 and verse 1. Now, you might remember that Mephibosheth was the son of David's late friend Jonathan, the grandson of Saul. He was the only survivor of the great tragic deaths of the line of Saul. Now, although Mephibosheth had grounds for a legal claim to his grandfather's throne, he accepted David as king. David then granted Mephibosheth, the grandson of Saul, the lands and the properties that belonged to him as the heir and the son of Jonathan. Now that was all the way back in chapter 9. Now, David had appointed Ziba to serve Mephibosheth as the caretaker of his estate. Now, coming along and carrying an ample supply of food and wine, it seems suspicious to David, who asks Ziba, "Where is thy master's son?" referring to Mephibosheth. In other words, why hasn't Mephibosheth met me? If he is my supporter as the king, why isn't he here? Well, that servant of Mephibosheth replied by betraying his master and even suggesting that Mephibosheth had planned to use Absalom's insurrection as an opportunity for him, the son of Jonathan, to usurp David on the throne. Well, hasty in his response, David, and failing to investigate the sincerity of Ziba's claim, David then right there bequeathed him, the servant of Mephibosheth, the lands and the properties that he had originally given to the son of Jonathan. Now, you and I are going to see later in our study that David would reverse his decision when he heard Mephibosheth's account. Now, we have, in verses 5 through 9, what I would suggest is the evidence of the madness of a bitter spirit. Now, as they often do, David's disappointments grew when one named Shimei, a Benjamite, and kin to Saul, greeted the king's flight from Jerusalem. Now, time and space do not allow me to develop the full account of that tragic scene, but it did mark one of the lowest moments of David's life. Now, this is recorded in verses 5 through 14. Now, we read that Shimei, this son of the tribe of Benjamin, Shimei cursed and he threw stones at David and his followers, calling the king a murderer and a worthless man. Verse 7. Now, Shimei also insisted that the humiliation David faced was deserved. And nevertheless, David endured the insults in silence. We read that one, Abishai, or Abishai as we've said at times, the son of Zeruiah, a brother of Joab. So this is one of the top men, one of the leaders of David's army. This Abishai, or Abishai, asked the king for permission to defend his honor, and he said concerning Shimei, "Let me go over, I pray thee, and take off his head." And yet we notice David's gracious and humble response, verse 10 through 14. David, we find, trusted in God's sovereignty, refused to seek revenge. Instead, he accepted Shimei's abuse as from the Lord in verse 10. In his sorrow, David reflected on his shame, and he said, Behold, my son, speaking of Absalom, which came forth of my bowels, seeketh my life. How much more now may this Benjamite, that is Shimei, how much more shall he do? Let him alone, let him curse, for the Lord hath bidden him, in verse 11. Now, determined to accept his humiliation, David said, verse 12, It may be that the Lord will look on mine affliction, and that the Lord will requite me good for his, Shimei's, cursing this day. Now, only when the king crossed the Jordan River did he and all the people that were with him refresh themselves. In other words, did he rest. Then we come back to Jerusalem. Now, we have Absalom, now who has usurped his father's throne, not only seizing the throne, but then committing a great evil before Israel, verses 15 through 23. Now, Absalom wasted no time in crowning himself king. And in verse 15, it seemed all Israel came to honor him, and among them was Ahithophel, Bathsheba's grandfather, verse 15. Now, Hushai, David's friend and spy, approached Absalom, and he declared, God save the king! God save the king! Now remember, he's the spy for David. Then, flattering Absalom's youthful confidence, Hushai convinced the young upstart that he had left David to serve Absalom. Ahithophel wanted to add more sorrow and shame to David, and likely feeling bitterness over the king's adultery with his granddaughter Bathsheba, Ahithophel advised Absalom to shame his father even more by entering his father's harem, committing incest with the king's concubines. Now, that's recorded in verse 20 and 21, but do you remember that David had left behind 10 concubines, no doubt to look after the palace in his absence? Well, Absalom uses that opportunity as a way to humiliate his father, David. And so we read in verse 22 that Absalom listened to Ahithophel's wicked advice and went into his father harem in the sight of all Israel. Well, a closing thought. In verse 23, for a time, Ahithophel's counsel seemed as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God, that is the holy place, the sanctuary of God. The old counselor was wise, but his advice would soon be ignored by Absalom in chapter 17 and verse 14. Now, as you and I will see, Ahithophel, Bathsheba's grandfather, allowed bitterness to poison his soul. He, in effect, committed sedition against David, God's anointed. And we'll find in chapter 17 that Ahithophel will choose to end his own life rather than face the consequences of his treason. In closing, I want to invite you to consider David's response to Shimei's curses and abuse that's recorded in verse 11 and 12. Now, David accepted Shimei's accusations with humility, recognizing there was truth in Shimei's words, and that truth being he was indeed a bloody man. Why? Because David's hands were stained with Uriah's blood. Well, as we'll see, the king embraced the sorrows and humiliations he endured as a result of his sins, and we find in that the prophecy of Nathan, chapter 12 and verse 7 through 12, was now fulfilled. David's secret sins became the cause of public sorrow and shame. I close with the words of poet Robert Southey, a poet in 1809 who said, "Curses are like young chickens. They always come home to roost." God bless. Thank you for being a part of our study, and bye-bye.